Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and welcome to the next segment in this series, where I play through The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and talk about what makes sense in the remake for this game that we are supposedly getting for Nintendo Switch 2. I've done several installments already, and this time we are focusing on the Water Temple. I actually initially planned on doing a combined video of the Water and Fire Temple, but I'm gonna be frank, the Water Temple kicked my butt. This is an infamous dungeon. It's considered to be one of the most challenging dungeons there is in Zelda, especially the original N64 version. And so it was interesting going through this experience again. I've played through this game so many times over the years, but now having it fresh, how do I feel about the Water Dungeon and how Nintendo should go about the changes with the Water Dungeon and surrounding it? Well, continuing where we left off from before, we had just finished the Forest Temple, we met the Deku Sprout, we saw our backstory, which I believe will have a lot more involved cutscene telling that story. But after that point, we can make a choice. You go back to the Temple of Time to meet Sheik, and Sheik gives you a few different options in terms of what you could do next. You could start going back to the past and going back and forth between the adult timeline and the child timeline, or you could go towards Death Mountain or Zora's Domain. The traditional way to go is to go to Death Mountain next, right after the Forest Temple, and get into the Fire Temple. But I thought it would be more interesting to do the Water Temple first, because you do have that option, and I think playing through the game in this way does show something that I think is important to stick around, the flexibility here. You see, you look at modern Zelda now with Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, you can do the dungeons out of order. In Ocarina of Time, they did have a little bit of flexibility here. It wasn't complete. For the first few dungeons, there is a set order, but now in the adult timeline, there's a few different phases here. And so you can choose to do the Water or the Fire Temple, and then after that, you have flexibility with the Spirit and Shadow Temple as well. I hope this maintains. But something I've been thinking about, depending on how ambitious this remake is going to be, is how Nintendo could handle the medallions. As we talked about before, initially there was a plan for the medallion to actually give you abilities, but that idea was cut in the final version of the original release. And so I speculate on the possibility that if Nintendo is going to be adding some significant new content in this remake, they could add a Light Temple dungeon, and with that, the Light Medallion, and it offering some ability, perhaps something having to do with light and lighting the way. And with the Forest Temple and that medallion, maybe that has something to do with gliding around. And the way I'm sort of starting to think about the powers of these medallions is actually very similar to how it works in Breath and Tears, where after you beat a dungeon, you have a certain power that you can use moving forward, and perhaps even gain the ability to use this power in the dungeon, but you can use it beyond it afterwards. And so in the case of the Water Medallion, the powers you would get from that would be powers you'd get from Princess Ruto, and you do meet Princess Ruto in the Water Temple when she's an adult, and so the idea is that she's helping you out to defeat this dungeon, but she's not actually very involved. So making her a bit more involved this time around I think would actually make a lot of sense, and perhaps this could even have to do with her bestowing some power upon you. And so the power I have in mind for the Water Medallion and what you could even use in the Water Temple is essentially a spin on the parry attack that originated in the Wind Waker, but we've seen in other Zelda games, where you lock on and you can spin around an enemy and attack them from behind, except this would have a water element to it, and perhaps it's even something you could do underwater as well, giving you more movement options and attack options underwater. Now obviously I'm speculating a lot here, it's just an idea I'm putting out there. I don't know if Nintendo would make this decision, but I think it's worth pointing out, because under the assumption Nintendo still allows you to handle the Water and Fire Temple in any order, the kind of abilities, if they were to give you some kind of abilities as a reward for beating these dungeons, would have to be abilities that you would not need to get into the other. So progression could still stay flexible, like Breath of the Wild and like Tears of the Kingdom. And I have also thought that they do need to modernize the combat in this remake to make it feel a little bit more comparable to modern Zelda games. And so this is one way I thought they could go about doing that, where some of the medallions, as you acquire them, they give you different combat abilities. And if you did decide to do the Fire Temple first and get the power from that, that could perhaps help you out into Water Temple and vice versa. But anyway, let's take a step back a bit before we actually get into the Water Temple and I talk about those changes there. In the lead up, you have to make your way towards Zora's domain, and there's some things I noticed here that I'd like to talk about. So, for example, being able to take your horse a bit further into these different areas. You see, you can only take Epona to basically Hyrule Field and Lake Hylia and the Gerudo area a little bit. She can't go anywhere else. But in other Zelda games, like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, you can take your horse pretty much anywhere. Not literally everywhere, but almost everywhere. And so I think it would make sense being able to take Epona into Castletown or Kakariko Village or further down the path to Zora's domain. I'm not saying we have to be able to get Epona into literally Zora's domain, but I do feel like it should be possible to get her to walk through that little stream of water and progress further along with her. And if they are expanding the map here, where things are a bit more fleshed out and larger in scale, then having Epona being able to go to other places so you can traverse these larger areas with more speed does make sense. But as we're trekking through Zora's domain in our adult form, we start to see some changes. There's snow falling. There are hints that Zora's domain has been frozen over, but it's very subtle. I would like for there to be perhaps a little bit less subtlety so we can kind of tell that there's been a shift in the season here, or at least maybe it should look kind of like that the deeper we get into Zora's domain, not just a couple little snow particles right before the waterfall. And then upon entry into Zora's domain, we actually see that everything's been frozen over. And so playing through this again, I'm just left to think about how much better this is going to look. Like, all the ice is opaque, but ice shouldn't be opaque. It should either be transparent or translucent. And so seeing far better ice effects, I think, makes a lot of sense, and not just ice, but also snow. Because if we are going to be seeing snowflakes, I imagine there'll be better particle effects there. There'll be some snow we'll actually be trudging through, seeing our footprints there. And when we get into the ice cavern as well, maybe the snow is actually really thick here, and so you actually kind of have to clear a path, so there could be a little bit of a subtle gameplay shift there. This makes a lot of sense to me. Now, on the note of ice and snowy areas, there is no depiction of the Hebra region in Ocarina of Time. That's more of a newer concept. But there is the northwestern part of Hyrule that is kind of empty. I'm not expecting Nintendo to add a whole other province for us to explore that's the Hebra region, with big icy mountains and a whole other story surrounding that, and then throwing in the Rito there, as cool as that would be a grand departure from what Ocarina of Time is. However, could there be references to the Rito, showing that they are supposed to exist in the timeline? Maybe they do throw in a character or two. Maybe they could at least put an icy, snowy, mountainous region off into the distance so we can at least see that it exists. I think putting in some of these subtle details into the overworld, into the background, would certainly be nice and would help Ocarina of Time to fit into the more modern understanding of the Zelda timeline. But before finishing up with the Ice Cavern here, there is something I want to mention. The Ice Wolf is an interesting enemy. To my understanding, this is the only time you fight this creature in the entirety of the game, and I guess it's sort of meant to be like a harder version of the wolf, but ultimately it still feels like a pretty basic mini-boss. I would love for them to flesh this out, make it feel a bit more grand. I know some people might even want Nintendo to turn the Ice Cavern into less of a mini-dungeon, but rather into a fully fledged dungeon. And I don't mind if they remix things a little bit here and expand on it a bit, especially because I'm here entertaining the idea of making the Ice Wolf at the end of the Ice Cavern feel like more of a legitimate boss. But if I'm just telling you what I think is going to happen, I don't think the mini-dungeons in the game are going to stop being mini-dungeons. If anything, maybe they could throw in another mini-dungeon or two to help fill up the world a little bit more, and so then you have these mini-dungeons and then you have these fully fledged dungeons. Which brings us to how things should be handled with the Water Temple. We get the Iron Boots from the Ice Cavern, and I'll just say that like the 3DS version, they should make the Iron Boots a lot easier to access. If anything, I would argue perhaps even streamlining it more so, perhaps making it kind of like a quick toggle on the fly, so you could be running around, you jump into a pond of water, and before having to press any start screen or going to any sort of sub-menu, you just press one of the many buttons on your controller and that switches the Iron Boots on immediately. But something else I think about in regards to the Iron Boots Because this would be a modern game, and the physics we've seen in different Zelda games since have improved dramatically, I think it'd be nice if they redid things a little bit here where we can feel the natural weight of the iron boots. Like, it's interesting that the iron boots allow us to get deep underwater, but we also can still hookshot around with the iron boots on, and lift ourselves up easily when climbing ledges while wearing the iron boots. It seems a little inconsistent, and I'm not saying that they should not allow Link to be able to do these things while wearing the iron boots, but perhaps at least adjust around the animations and the sound effects to show that there's a little bit more work being put in here. Like, if you are wearing the iron boots, maybe you hear the hookshot working a little bit harder, or when Link is lifting himself up while wearing the iron boots, you can see he's struggling a little bit more and is a little bit slower to do it. I think that would make a lot of sense. What may not make sense, though, is the water temple itself. So many people have complained about this dungeon. It's a challenging dungeon. Me going through the original again here, it's fresh in my mind, and there are times where it is frustrating. The iron boot part is not even the most frustrating part. That's just kind of one minor annoyance, and actually, changing the water levels to me wasn't that big of a deal either. But I say this as someone who has gone through this dungeon several times. Nintendo did make some adjustments to the water temple in the 3DS version. I think clearly labeling things so we know where we can go to adjust the water level does help, and making the iron boots more readily accessible also does help. I'll say us being able to put on little beacons or markers all throughout the map so we can get a better understanding of visualizing where different things are and being able to backtrack and all, because that's going to happen a lot in the water temple as you're trying to figure out different parts. But some people might even argue that they should just redesign the water temple altogether. And I've considered this as a possibility in this remake, that they basically create entirely new dungeons that just take heavy inspiration and have the essence of the original dungeons, but they're their own experience now. I'm all for that idea, but I'm also okay with them just remixing things a little bit and improving upon the experience. So assuming they still keep the water temple essentially what it is, just with some reworkings here, I think with the improved visuals, one thing that I've gone stuck on several times every time I've gone back to the water temple every few years is the middle tower of the water dungeon. When you change the water level, there's actually an opening to access a room under this central pillar to the water temple, and the game technically does give you a subtle hint because there's a cutscene that plays when the water level changes, and you technically can see the platform moving with an opening, but it's super subtle, and because of the graphics of the time, you wouldn't notice as much. And so there have been multiple times where I've just been going back and forth looking for that last key just to get forward, and I can't because I just missed that clue because it just wasn't very clear. I think with the improved visuals, that clue of a hidden room in that central pillar to the dungeon should be a little bit more obvious. Now, something else that I think should change is what happens with Princess Ruto. I mentioned earlier how maybe she gives us an ability and that's tied to the water medallion, and we can use that even throughout the dungeon, and if we're gonna have this new ability, perhaps they should change around the puzzles a little bit with that in mind, or the enemies as well. I would love that. But something that I always found weird is how Princess Ruto swims up, we're supposed to follow her, and then she's just gone. You don't see her again until you beat the water temple, and it's kind of funny because Princess Ruto in the dungeon where you're inside Jabu Jabu, she's far more involved, and you see her taken away and all, and you see her when you rescue her. If something happens to Princess Ruto inside the water temple, they should make that clear. They should give us some indication there. But a few more things that make sense to change in the water temple, assuming they stick with the core design of it. When you get the long shot, you should be able to use it to skip upwards, because up until this point you're struggling going back and forth changing the water levels, and that is time consuming. It would be kind of nice to be able to use the long shot to just kind of skip through all of this and get exactly to where you need to go. So I think offering these hookshot points, or if they're going to make the hookshot have a little bit more options in terms of connecting to things, just give us those options and offer little ledges so we can actually get to these points and not actually be required to raise the water level again after we've gone the long shot to get to these higher up points. I think that would just speed things up, and you would feel like that greater sense of reward for acquiring the long shot. And another little thing, and potentially this could be more than a little thing, But like, say when you slash through a pillar of water, or when you jump down and you see a splash, I want to see some better water physics, some different animations to show the splashing. And if they are going to be remixing things here, given that it is a water temple and we may be having to deal with some water physics, that could be pretty interesting too. But one big issue I have with the water temple that I think would greatly benefit the experience here is how you don't find any fairies in the lead up to the battle with Dark Link, the mini-boss for this dungeon. Arguably the toughest mini-boss in the game, maybe even just one of the hardest bosses in the game, period. Very challenging boss, and I love it. I'm not complaining about the Dark Link fight at all. What I am complaining about, though, is the weird difficulty spike and then the spike downwards after that. Because I found 4 fairies after I beat Dark Link when I could access the other areas with the long shot and get to Morpha, the main boss for this dungeon. You need the fairies to revive yourself against Dark Link, but not the actual main boss, which I just think is really funny. You have all these fairies, but in many cases, you're not going to die. Maybe you will if you're a little bit less inexperienced with this boss, but it's just not really a hard boss. In general, I think that they should redesign the bosses in this game to feel like more fleshed out epic battles, make them feel more grand, go all in on the epicness here. And specifically with Morpha, Morpha is one of the most anticlimactic bosses in the game, and so I would like them to rework this boss fight here, make Morpha actually more threatening, a little bit more of a challenge. Something that's actually a cool concept with the Morpha fight though is that Morpha does try to sneak around you and does create multiple kind of water tentacles to get at you, and when there's multiple, sometimes they can sneak around you and you have to pay attention to the audio cues because there's a spatial audio, which is very cool. And so really what I'm getting at here is that I want them to go even deeper into this, maybe make the Morpha battle a little bit more scary, like it's maybe darker and there are different water tentacles that are hiding around, sneaking around. And so making this boss fight feel perhaps a little bit kind of like a horror game where there's a little bit of a chase and hiding, I think could make this fight way more interesting. And then, of course, scale up the size a little bit more, make him feel a little bit more menacing. That would make sense too. But upon completing the water temple, you find yourself at Lake Hylia, you see this monologue from Sheik, and I've talked about how I anticipate there's going to be voice acting and more involved dramatic cutscenes. I could envision them putting together some pretty good voice acting here in this scene with Sheik, but there's also some humor here as well, and I really hope they capture that right. But it is also a little bit of a hint that Sheik is trying to keep distance from Link. And so a better depiction of that and the facial expressions and their interactions in a voice-acted cutscene, I think would be really special. But one last thing I'll mention here. This tree here, right next to this warp point, there's a big slash on it. Why is it there? Maybe if they're expanding upon the Ice Wolf boss fight, perhaps they can mix things up a little bit here and add a few story details that kind of show some sort of story relating to some sort of beast that would cause this slash. Maybe that being some sort of great ice glacial wolf that we fight in the ice cavern. So some explanation there, even if it's not exactly that, would be a nice little detail that could be added here. But those are all my thoughts on changes that make sense in a remake for Ocarina of Time surrounding the Water Temple events of the game. Having gone through this entire recording here, I now realize that if I had also combined the Fire Temple, this would be a way longer video. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. If you've gone this far and you found yourself enjoying the video and you haven't subscribed already, I would appreciate your subscription. But I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.